It's June 2024, and Ubisoft Minds has finally broken all of the speculation and rumor mills by announcing Anno 117 Pax Romana, the next entry in the now fairly mainstream Anno series. Over the course of the next year, we were treated to dev blogs, screenshots, blogs, video clips, and more, as the excitement and anticipation surrounding the release of Anno 117 drew closer. Fast forward to November of 2025, and the wider public finally got their hands on the game. 6 months later, where are we at with that? Mixed reviews, a very hesitant and reluctant player base, and many more questions than answers. In this video, I want to take a look at Anno 117 and the state that it is in 6 months after release. We've had a number of patches, as well as a DLC drop. This isn't going to be a completely negative video though. I want to take a look at the things that are doing well, what players like, but I also do want to take a look at the criticisms. I want to take a look at things like player numbers and player retention, as well as the reception of patches and the latest DLC. I'm also going to have some of my own personal thoughts and opinions on the game mixed in with this, and I would love to hear your thoughts and comments down below in the comments section. For better or worse, Anno 117 is 6 months old now, and it's time for a little checkup on the state of the game. If you want to listen to this in the background, feel free, as all of the video on screen is simply B-roll footage and trailers, though I have a couple of places where I will show some graphics on the screen, but I will call that out when it happens. Let's start this video off by talking about the overall mood in the community and what people seem to generally think about Anno 117. While I've not been actively playing Anno lately, I still do keep my finger on the pulse of the community. I keep up with what people are saying, and I watch the general mood of it all. I think there's one sentence that really captures the general feeling from many players about Anno 117. It has a strong foundation, but currently has a weaker staying power than Anno 1800. Players seem to widely praise the Roman setting, the visuals, the atmosphere, the improved accessibility and player experience. However, a lot of veteran Anno fans really feel that the game lacks depth, replayability, and long-term complexity that Anno 1800 really developed over years of DLC support. The bones are there. The foundations that make an Anno game fun and enjoyable and addicting are there, but it's just missing something. It's missing that hook that keeps people coming back over and over again, recommending it to their friends, and continuing to sell more and more copies of the game and increasing those player numbers. So if that is the overall community mood, let's start breaking things down into a couple of different categories here. What do players like about Anno 117? The Roman architecture, the culture systems, the atmosphere. You really do feel like you are in Rome. The developers, I think, beautifully captured the essence and the feeling of the Roman Empire at the height of its power. I don't think anyone can lay any sort of blame on the art team, because as usual, they completely knocked it out of the park. I have seen some people say that Anno 1800 looks better than Anno 117. However, that seems to be a very small minority of the player base. Most people would agree, and I myself am one of those people, that Anno 117 looks gorgeous. The visual updates to the Anno engine elevate it above Anno 1800 significantly. There's always room for improvement, and there's always small art assets that some players may not like. But overall, if you're in Latium, you feel like you are in the heart of the Roman Empire. When you're building in Albion, the rain and the fog brings you into the immersion of being in the British Isles. It is a visually stunning game. Players also like many of the quality of life systems that were brought over from Anno 1800, as well as reimagined and reintroduced systems from previous Anno games. The logistics and trade systems were updated and have many new features that make managing your island's resources and trade routes cleaner and simpler to use, as well as the excellent onboarding for newer players. One of the big criticisms of Anno 1800 was the lack of in-game guidance. Many mechanics and features were not explained on how they worked until much later in the game's development cycle, when they started adding in the in-game wiki and info tooltips. Those systems are baseline in Anno 117 now, as well as pop-ups that explain the basics of various mechanics and how they work, so players aren't sitting there scratching their heads trying to figure out what they're doing. But I think one of the most appreciated new features in Anno 117 is the level of customization at game setup. Regular viewers of the channel and on my Discord will probably hear me saying this a lot. This is definitely one of the most customizable and player-friendly Annos that they have made. The level of customization during game setup is absolutely phenomenal and lets you create the exact game that you want to play in terms of difficulty. Even down to certain features can just be turned off if you don't even want to fool with them. The developers received, rightfully so, a lot of praise for that system. On the surface, it looks like the perfect Anno game. It checks so many boxes. It seemed to have everything there. However, if we peel back the onion a little bit, we'll start seeing the criticisms and the flaws. One of the biggest complaints is that Anno 117 feels smaller than Anno 1800. These complaints started day one, and they exist to this day, 6 months later. Now, I want to stay on this topic for just a moment, on the comparison between Anno 1800 and Anno 117 in terms of size. Reddit user Paragrald created this excellent graphic right here comparing Anno 1800 at launch with Anno 117 at launch. This is, in my opinion, the only way to compare the two games. As you can see, Anno 117 has a lot more features and mechanics than Anno 1800 did at launch, although majority of those are features that were brought over from DLCs or features that were added to Anno 1800 over time that were carried over. On paper, Anno 117 is the larger game at release. Yet the criticism still remains from many players that it feels smaller. Added on to that, many players feel there is less end-game complexity and fewer mega projects. Now again, the fewer mega projects to me is an unfair criticism since Anno 1800 only launched with one monument, the World's Fair. Anno 117 launched with the Amphitheater. We know that in August of this year, we are getting the Hippodrome as a second monument, and Dawn of the Delta will most likely include a monument as well. So we are going to end the first season of Anno 117 with 3 monuments in the game, whereas at the end of Season 1 of Anno 1800, we only had 2 monuments, the World's Fair and the airship hangar in the Arctic. Less in-game complexity, however, is a fair criticism. The production chains in Anno 117 are fairly simple when compared to Anno 1800. Changes in production and consumption rates created a system where you needed less production for the same amount of population when compared to Anno 1800. Let's compare one of the final unlocks for the patricians in Anno 117, being the chariots, to one of the final unlocks in Anno 1800 for the investors, being the steam carriages. For the sake of comparing these as equally as I can, I'm going to compare them using the optimal amount of buildings for the fastest input. So for the cab assembly line for the steam carriages, 2 cab assembly lines needs 3 motor assemblies, 8 coach makers, 1 lumberjack's hut, 4 caoutchouc plantations, 2 furnaces, 4 smelteries, 2 zinc mines, 2 copper mines, 1 coal mine, and 1 iron mine. That is a significant amount of buildings, workforce, maintenance costs, and resources to set all of that up. In comparison, the chariots, 4 wagon makers would need 3 horse catchers, 3 frame builders, 2 reed collectors, and 1 lumberjack. Now again, this is without any DLCs, and this is just baseline. Just looking at that right there, as a single example, shows that the Anno 1800 production chains were more involved and required a lot more input for the output to be produced. Other examples show a very similar trend. The production chains in Anno 117 are simpler. Now, whether that is a good or bad thing really depends on the player's opinion that is giving it to you. However, it is still a primary criticism that I do see across the board. Outside of that, players also complain that it feels that you go through the progression phases of the game much faster, there's a shorter gameplay loop. It is much easier to reach the end of patricians than it was to reach the end of investors. There is also far less incentive to continue to upgrade to patricians in the base game. In Anno 1800, you really wanted to have as many investors as possible because you wanted to have as much influence as you could get. The influence was required for ships, trade unions, town halls, and many other aspects of the game. Patricians don't have anything concrete that they give you besides some slightly better number balancing on your city status attributes and a little bit more coin. Personally, myself, I usually only have enough patricians to get the amphitheater finished, and then everything else is mostly equities. I have no incentive to continue upgrading into patricians right now, and to me, that breaks the gameplay loop. If I am not incentivized to continue to progress my civilization and upgrade my people beyond a certain tier because the final tier really doesn't give me anything substantial, then why would I go ahead and upgrade all of them? Yes, you will lower consumption slightly of the equities goods, but the majority of the patrician goods are more trouble to produce than they are worth, in my opinion. Again, personal preference, my opinion on it. Other players may disagree, and that is perfectly fine, but it is still a broad criticism that many players share with me. One of the major flaws that leaves a sour taste in almost everybody's mouth, however, right now, is the campaign. The campaign definitely was rushed. It was cut. There's plenty of Act 3 data showing in the game files, proving that they had more story to tell, more stuff to do. To my knowledge, there has been no official communication from Ubisoft Minds on this topic. If I have missed something somewhere, please just let me know down below. I did try to do as much research as I could, and I looked up everything I could find, and I didn't see anything publicly stated by the developers about Act 3. However, it is common knowledge that Act 3 was supposed to be there, but it was cut out. The campaign ends rather abruptly, and it is still a very hot topic that people like to talk about. Anno 1800's campaign was nothing to write home about. It was kind of a one and done, and most people didn't go back and play it again because it was boring and whatever. However, Anno 117's campaign had the structure for a really interesting narrative, and then it fell off the cliff and you were just thrown back to Latium with very little direction on what was going on, what was happening, and many storylines were left hanging. I'm sure we will never see Act 3 materialize due to resources and development time, because the writers at Ubisoft Minds have proven that they can create a really interesting and compelling story. We saw it with Land of Lions, and we started seeing that with Anno 117. And it is very unfortunate that we may never see the conclusion of what that story was supposed to tell us, and what the writers had planned out for it. I myself don't fault the developers at all for Act 3 being cut. It is most likely a decision that was forced on them by Ubisoft, the parent company and publisher. Some of it may also have had to do with partial funding for Anno 117 coming from the German government, and they had deadlines that they were required to meet to fulfill their obligations for the grant money that helped create the game. So between government deadlines and publisher deadlines, things had to be cut, but it still stings. The UI and UX also received a lot of criticism from the player base, as they felt that the UI had been tailored for console first and then PC second. Now, this is something I personally disagree with, and I think the UI is perfectly fine in Anno 117. However, I'm not here to disparage any criticisms or anybody's opinion, because it is a valid opinion. If you don't like a UI, you're not going to like that UI. There are other games that I play that I dislike the UI that other players think is perfectly fine. Everyone has their own preferences on stuff like that, but it was and continues to be a broad criticism. And lastly, many players feel like the economic pressure and challenge was reduced compared to earlier games. It is quite easy to quickly start turning a profit and making money with a very small population, even on higher difficulty settings. Overall, I think there are a lot of valid criticisms about Anno 117. It definitely didn't feel as polished as it really should have been on release. There were a large number of somewhat game-breaking bugs that took until after the first of the year to fix. Most notably, and I know many players will probably have PTSD when I say this, but if you got booted offline or intermittently lost connection to the Ubisoft servers for some reason, you would lose access to the 3 baseline gods in Latium and Albion. Many players felt like this bricked their saves because they lost access to a lot of bonuses that they were using to manage their economies. The unfortunate timing is what kind of factored into a lot of that. The game released on November 13th, and the team went on a roughly 1-month vacation for the holidays. They completely deserve that time with their family and their friends around the holidays. And I do not hold them at fault whatsoever for the length of time that it took to fix some of these issues. However, players were upset about it, and the number of bugs in general. A number of patches have been released, of course, fixing many issues. And then there was patch 1.5 that seemed to break the trust of a lot of players about the quality of the patches coming from the team. I think it is safe to say that Ubisoft Minds has lost a bit of trust in the community, but I personally know that they are doing everything they can to win that back. 6 months later, what do the player numbers and retention for those players tell us about the state of the game right now? Anno 1.17 launched very strongly. It reached one of the highest concurrent player counts in franchise history. However, that did not last long. The retention has been weaker than expected compared to Anno 1800. All of the numbers I'm going to give you are from the Steam charts, as we don't obviously have data for Ubisoft Connect, the Epic Games Store, or console. However, it is worth remembering that Anno 1800 was initially listed on Steam before release as a pre-order, and then it was removed from Steam and made an Epic exclusive, but it came back a few years later on Steam again. Anno 1.17 launched concurrently across all platforms. Even with the time that Anno 1800 was not on Steam, I would venture a wild guess that the majority of people playing an Anno game are playing it through Steam, especially Anno 1.17, since it was available on Steam from day one without being delisted. Anno 1800 peaked at around 25,000 players when it came back onto Steam several years ago. After that, player numbers dropped as they typically do, and right now, Anno 1800 averages between 2,200 to 2,400 players per day. Anno 1.17 peaked just under 22,000 players at launch. However, it saw a quicker drop-off in the number of daily players, and right now it averages between 1,600 and 1,800 players per day. Anno 1.17 launched very strong. Anno 1800 just has this unusually strong staying power for such an old game, and many players simply just went back to Anno 1800 after finishing Anno 1.17's launch content. Browsing Reddit and Discord, this seems to be a common sentiment among players. I played Anno 1.17, and when I finished, I went back to Anno 1800 because it felt like a more complete game. When Prophecies of Ash came out, there was a bump in those player numbers, but again, they quickly dropped back down, and Anno 1800's numbers went back up. So players checked it out, they checked out Sinis, they played around with the volcano, they quit, they went back to Crown Falls. So let's talk about Prophecies of Ash real quick. The DLC announcement actually generated a lot of interest because it promised the biggest island in franchise history. The volcano mechanics, the obsidian production chains, disaster gameplay. Many players thought this is the first step towards a bigger, more complex Anno that people are wanting. And then the DLC came out, and it was quickly discovered that Sinis was not the largest island in Anno history. The developers had touted that it was roughly 13% larger than Crown Falls, and unfortunately, that was not accurate. It was 7% smaller. This was due to an error in how they calculated the buildable tiles. It is unfortunate that players caught that before the actual developers did, and it caused a lot of controversy. There were also many complaints about the volcano being more abstract because it's not really part of the island itself that you're building on. It's off to the side. It's off there, over in the side, doing its thing on occasion. It's not really impacting your island itself in comparison to something like the volcanoes in Anno 1404 or even Anno 1602, where the volcanoes were part of the island itself. Now, visually, I would say the volcano is amazing. I think it looks phenomenal. I think the ash storms afterwards look phenomenal. I think it's really cool looking. But really cool looking doesn't always mean good gameplay or just a good feeling about it. There is also what I consider a very unfortunate decision by the developers to have the obsidian mechanics tied to the eruptions. The soil fertility and mineral fertility boosts, those I can understand being tied to eruptions. It makes sense. However, obsidian being a finite resource tied to the eruption cycle itself, creates a situation where if a player does not want to actually deal with the hassle of the eruptions, they're losing access to 90% of a DLC they paid for, and all they're really getting is an island that's barely larger than the largest islands in the game. For a game that was created to be as customizable and player-friendly as possible, not allowing players to at least have access to the obsidian in a bottlenecked production time that still keeps the obsidian as a rare resource but not finite, is a pretty massive loss in my book. You should at least be able to obtain obsidian even if the disasters are disabled in very small quantities, so you can at least get the specialists from Cecilia. Overall, the reception for Prophecies of Ash is mixed to negative. It currently sits at a negative in reviews on Steam. Most of the feedback relates to the island being smaller than marketed, balance frustrations and progression restrictions, bugs and technical issues at launch, micromanagement complaints, and the volcano mechanics do become repetitive for some players over time. I honestly think a simple change, like making obsidian available as a very rare resource at all times, would go a long way to showing a little goodwill towards the player base and not locking all the features of the DLC behind having the volcano turned on. Have some of them locked behind it. Again, the soil fertility makes perfect sense to be tied to the eruption cycle, but at least let players play with a little bit more of the DLC than they currently have access to. So overall, I think the main sentiment is that the core foundation is very strong. It has the potential to be an amazing game. Ubisoft Minds earned a ton of goodwill from Anno 1800 and showed that they could make an amazing masterpiece of a game. Almost to the point that I really think expectations were unrealistically high because of the final form of Anno 1800. When I was in Germany last year at Gamescom, and I got to talk to many of the developers and other members of the team, as well as other members of the community, that seemed to be something that several of us were concerned about. Players had this really high expectation for Anno 117 based on Anno 1800 after 6 years of DLC updates. And when the game didn't meet all of those checkboxes that some people had in their heads, it started creating a negative feedback loop. However, I think a lot of people are cautiously optimistic that future content updates will significantly improve the game. We have the Hippodrome coming out in a couple of months, with Dawn of the Delta at the end of the year. In a roadmap that the team released back in April, they mentioned quality of life updates that are coming, such as additions to the stats screen, the item viewer, mod.io integration into the game, and other quality of life updates. I definitely think some of these need to come sooner rather than later. The stats screen, for example, is one of those that I was boggled at the lack of data available to us in that menu when I got my hands on the game before launch. They are just databases presenting data from the game. That's it. There's nothing special about it. The storage tab, the passive and active trade breakdowns, so you could see when ships were coming and going, how much they were dropping off, what was being bought and sold. All of that stuff is simply game data that was being presented visually for you in a screen. That was it. Why was that not included? Why was the item viewer not included? It's just a database search query. That's all it is. We are 6 months after release and we still don't have some of the basic tools that were available to us in Anno 1800. We know that they are coming, but some of that stuff we're waiting almost a year to get. The current consensus seems to be visuals and atmosphere, amazing. The Roman setting, awesome. Accessibility and quality of life, pretty good, could use a little work. The campaign, complete failure. The end game depth, it's a mixed bag. Player retention, very weak. Prophecies of Ash DLC, mixed to negative, depending on how you view the disaster system. The future potential of the game, however, is still considered very high. Anno 117 is viewed right now as a very strong city builder, with really great presentation and great long-term potential, but one that has not yet matched that staying power and complexity of Anno 1800. I would say the mood in the community is not overwhelmingly negative, but a lot of people, myself included, are just waiting to see how future updates and DLC expansions really evolve the experience. I have not actually opened up Anno 117 since the end of February. That's the last time I played. I don't have the urge to play it like I did Anno 1800. I have just over 400 hours in the game as of launch. If I include testing, early access, and other times I was able to play the game before launch, I'm probably somewhere around 1,000 to 1,200 hours. So I have put a significant amount of time into the game. Am I going to play Anno 117 again? Yes, I do want to get back into Anno. It's a fun game. I really enjoy it. But at the moment, it is not the kind of game that I would sit and play all day, every day. I would play for a couple of hours a week, maybe, and then put it down until some updates come along that give me something else to do. I'm interested to see what the game looks like at the end of this year, and if the next 2 content updates bring the game up to a level where people start viewing it as a contender against Anno 1800 instead of the small sibling that's just trying to play catch up. Because right now, Anno 117, as good as it is, does have a lot of catching up to do to Anno 1800 to truly make it the next big masterpiece from Ubisoft Minds.